The Brazen Bull. Invented in ancient Greece, this was a hollow bronze statue of a bull where victims were locked inside and a fire was lit underneath. As the metal heated, the victim would slowly roast to death. The inventor was so proud of his creation that the king actually made him its very first victim. Scaphism. This ancient Persian method involved trapping a victim between two wooden boats and force-feeding them milk and honey until they suffered severe sickness. They were then covered in more honey and pushed into a stagnant pond where insects would eat them alive over several weeks, before finally dying of dehydration and rot. The rack. This was a simple wooden frame with rollers at both ends, designed to slowly pull the victim's body apart. Interrogators would crank the handle, popping the shoulders, hips, and knees out of their sockets with sickening snaps. Blood Eagle. The Vikings reserved this ritualistic execution for their most hated enemies, slicing the victim's back open while they were completely conscious. They would then snap the ribs from the spine and fold them outward to look like bloody wings, completely erase your dignity before entering the afterlife. Impalement. Made famous by Vlad the Impaler, this involved forcing a greased, blunt wooden stake through the victim's lower body and planting it upright in the ground. Gravity would slowly pull the victim down over several days, while the blunt tip carefully avoided vital organs to keep them alive as long as possible. It was a psychological weapon. Invading armies would often retreat in pure terror after seeing thousands of bodies suspended in the air. Flaying. Used heavily by the ancient Assyrians, this was the agonizing process of skinning a human being completely alive. Executioners would make precise cuts at the feet and slowly peel the skin upward in one single continuous sheet, while their skin was proudly nailed to city walls as a warning to rebels. Keelhauling. This was a naval punishment where a sailor was tied to a rope and dragged underneath the hull of a massive wooden ship. The bottom of the ship was covered in razor-sharp barnacles that would shred the victim's flesh to the bone as they were pulled across. If you didn't drown in the freezing water, you usually bled to death on the deck moments after being pulled back up. The breaking wheel. In medieval Europe, victims were tied to a giant wooden wagon wheel, while an executioner smashed their limbs with a heavy iron bar. They were then hoisted into the air and left to be eaten alive by crows over the course of several agonizing days. Crucifixion. The Roman Empire perfected this execution, stripping the victim naked and nailing their wrists and feet to a heavy wooden cross. You didn't die from the nails. You died from slow suffocation because the position of your arms made it impossible to exhale. To take a single breath, victims had to push themselves up on the nailed feet, rubbing their scourged backs against the splintered wood. Lingchi, also known as death by 1,000 cuts. An executioner would use a sharp knife to systematically slice away tiny pieces of flesh from the chest, thighs, and arms over several hours. The goal was to inflict the maximum possible amount of pain without hitting a fatal artery until the final, merciful strike to the heart. Rat torture. Interrogators would strap a metal bucket filled with starving rats directly onto the victim's bare stomach. They would then place a burning hot coal on top of the bucket, causing the rats to panic from the intense heat. Desperate to escape the fire, the rats would literally burrow straight down, boiling alive. From ancient Asia to medieval England, dropping a human into a giant cauldron of boiling water, oil, or tar was a legal punishment. The sheer heat would instantly destroy the outer layer of skin and boil the fluid inside the victim's eyeballs. If they were lowered in feet first, it could take up to 2 agonizing hours for the brain to finally shut down from the shock. Strappado. The victim's hands were tied tightly behind their back, and they were hoisted high into the air by a rope attached to their wrists. The executioner would then drop them suddenly, stopping the rope just before they hit the ground, violently dislocating both shoulders at once. During the Inquisition, they would often attach heavy iron weights to the victim's feet to make the tearing of the joints even more catastrophic. Immurement. This is the horrifying practice of being locked away in a tiny, dark, enclosed space with absolutely no exit. Ancient Roman Vestal virgins who broke their vows were placed inside a brick tomb with a single loaf of bread and a candle, and walled up alive. You wouldn't die of physical trauma. You would slowly descend into absolute madness as you starved to death in total, suffocating darkness. The Judas Cradle. The victim was suspended naked in the air, using ropes and slowly lowered onto a wooden pyramid with a razor-sharp tip. The executioner controlled the ropes, dropping the person's entire body weight onto the point. It was completely designed to avoid drawing blood, meaning the victim could be kept alive and tortured on the device for several days. Bamboo torture. Used in parts of Asia, a victim would be tied down securely over a patch of freshly cut bamboo shoots. Bamboo is one of the fastest-growing plants on Earth, capable of shooting up several inches in a single day. Over the course of a week, the sharp plants would physically grow straight through the victim's skin, muscles, and organs, pinning them to the earth. The Pear of Anguish. This was a heavy iron tool shaped like a piece of fruit that consisted of 4 metal leaves. It was inserted into a victim's mouth, and the torturer would slowly turn a screw at the top, forcing the leaves to violently expand. It would shatter the jawbone completely, ensuring the victim could never speak or eat again. Saw torture. The victim was hung completely upside down by their feet, forcing all their blood to rush directly to their brain. 2 executioners would then take a massive 2-man saw and begin cutting the person directly in half, starting from the groin. Because the blood was pooled in the head, the victim would remain fully conscious and aware until the saw literally reached their chest. The head crusher. This device looked like a metal cap connected to a chin rest by a giant, slowly turning screw. As the interrogator cranked the handle, the victim's teeth would shatter into their jaw first. The executioner would keep turning until the victim's skull fractured completely. The Spanish tickle. Also known as the cat's paw, this was an iron tool resembling a small rake with long, needle-sharp claws. Executioners would rake it down the victim's arms, chest, and back, effortlessly tearing away huge chunks of flesh and muscle down to the bone. But the massive open wounds almost always led to a slow, agonizing death from infection. Mazzatello, used heavily in the Papal States, the victim would be marched to a public square and forced to kneel on a wooden scaffold. The executioner would take a massive wooden mallet and swing it down onto the victim's skull with devastating force. As the victim fell unconscious, the executioner would pull a knife and slit their throat, turning the execution into a gruesome public spectacle. The iron chair. This was a heavy iron throne, completely covered in hundreds of razor-sharp steel spikes. The victim would be strapped down tightly, forcing the spikes deep into their back, arms, and legs, making it impossible to breathe without excruciating pain. To make it worse, interrogators would often light a fire underneath the iron seat, slowly roasting the victim while they bled. Neck roasting. Originating in ancient China, the victim was forced into a heavy wooden stockade known as a kangu. They were then forced to stand on a platform of burning hot coals or hot stones. If they tried to lift their feet to escape the heat, the heavy wooden block would brutally strangle them by the neck. Oubliette. Coming from the French word to forget, this was a specialized dungeon shaped like a narrow, vertical bottle. Prisoners were dropped through a trapdoor in the ceiling into a pitch-black pit where they couldn't even sit down or bend their knees. They were literally thrown in and forgotten, left in utter darkness surrounded by the rotting skeletons of the people who were dropped in before them. The tub. The victim was placed in a wooden tub with only their head sticking out, and the executioner would paint their face with milk and honey. Over several days, they were fed regularly so they would excrete waste directly into the tub, creating a breeding ground for insects. The bugs would eventually devour the victim's body from the inside out, while they were forced to sit in their own decaying filth. I will be making more videos like this. Subscribe to see more.